Mute myself.
Robin, Michael, I believe you're muted.
Yeah, no, I was just chatting offline with some of the folks that are here.
Of course, no problem.
So Ezra, for the sake of time, let's go ahead and get started. As people continue to wander in, we can welcome them in. But why don't you share the lyrics to our song for today? It's Eli, Eli, which is a song sung in honor of the Holocaust.
So this is this. So this song, as Rabbi Michael said, is sung in honor of the Holocaust. Was composed by a, I believe, prisoner of war in the Holocaust. My facts might be slightly wrong, but I think that's it. And the song goes, Eli, Eli, shelo yigamer leolam, hachol v'hayam, rishru shel hamayim, v'harak hashamayim, Tfilat Adam. O Lord, my God, I pray that these things never end. The sand and the sea, the rush of the waters, the crash of the heavens, the prayer of the heart.
Thank you, Ezra. A poignant way to get started today. This is going to be a different kind of session. It's going to be heavy and hard, and there won't be a lot of fun in this one. And what we have to do, even before we dive into the concept, is say that there are two ways to construct Jewish identity. We can construct it from all the ways we celebrate and all the things we do that are Jewish and all the beautiful ways that we love our Jewish identity, or we can construct it out of the negativity, out of the horrors and the hatreds. And depending on your generational intersection with the Holocaust and the trauma of this, some people certainly develop their identity about being Jews out of one idea or the other. And what I want to posit perhaps, which is a really like next generation future piece to think about, is for many folks of my parents' generation, so people in their 70s, 80s, that second story of the terrible nature of the Holocaust was so foundational to their Jewish identity. The trauma of that, it's almost like PTSD. Everything in their life is built out of that PTSD relationship. My generation wasn't born with that burden. We're born with, as children of the survivors, right? We had to deal with our parents' trauma.
Yeah.
And so what we're beginning to see is the next generation were the grandkids of the survivors. And now we're beginning to see even that next generation after that. We're actually witnessing perhaps the last years of the survivors themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it's this really interesting shifting and changing around Jewish identity. Are we constructing it only out of the terrors and the horrors of the Holocaust? Or are we blending it in with the positives? Or if we talk to our college students on campuses, they have no relationship to it. It's not part of their lived experience. It's distant from many of their family experiences. And so it's really kind of this fascinating evolution of this. So I just want to kind of put that out as just an opening thought about today's session. And I want to kind of, before we dive any deeper, do a quick check-in. So if you on Zoom want to add in your chat bar a sentence about something new or good for you. We've had a really busy week here at Temple Beth Shalom. I'll turn to the folks who are here in the room to get a quick new or good. So why don't you get us started?
So I work at a school, I'm a teacher, and we had spring break this week. And it was a great, nice reset.
Nice. That's great.
Same old, nothing new.
Okay.
Pretty stressful week, but accomplished what I needed to.
Nothing new, just, just the regular.
Okay.
Yep.
Alex, as you're settling in, we're asking people what is new or good in their lives in the past week. So a quick thought about new or good.
I got my high school transcripts to apply to colleges and they were not as bad as I remember.
Okay, that's good. That's great. Ezra, if you can walk us through the chat responses.
Of course. One person says that their dad and sister came over for lunch today, which was nice. One person's says their grandmother's test results were normal after what looked like a mini stroke. One person said they made it to O'Hare Airport this morning and has only a little further to go in their travel. One person who said that a friend who had been out of touch for several years called and they got to catch up and had a virtual hug, which was very heartening. And someone's dog got first in a competition.
We have 2 dog competitors in our
Wow.
group today, so seeing a dog getting first is exciting for this group. Okay, let me kind of rearrange the chat a little bit so we can spread the faces out. And we can ditch the chat for now. Okay. So we're going to be diving in first with a history overview of anti-Semitism to kind of get us grounded in that, because I feel like the Holocaust as an academic topic has to be based on how anti-Semitism shifts and changes over time. That anti-Semitism of 1,000 years ago in Christian Europe is very different than what we might have seen in Russia 100 years ago or in Nazi Germany 75 years ago. So I want to get us back to, let's start off at about 1,000 years ago when we talked about the Jews living in Spain and in North Africa, that Muslim experience where Jews were living for 500 years in the golden age of Spain. And at that time, we talked about how Jews were really thriving, that they were pretty much living in what was called dhimmi status, so they were protected. And living among the Muslims was a place for them to flourish professionally and academically. And at that time, we also pointed out that a lot of Christian anti-Semitism was beginning to take root. So we know in 1096 was the first Crusades in Jerusalem. The Pope, there's a huge effort by Christians to reclaim Jerusalem. And the Jerusalem they're trying to reclaim is a Jerusalem that's controlled by the Muslims. So one of the interesting questions about anti-Semitism 1,000 years ago is, well, it might be an argument against Jewish religion and Jews being blamed for the death of Jesus. It might also be there as an argument against Islam as well, that these 2 groups, the Jews and the Muslims, are the minorities and the Christians are the majority. And it could simply be the Christian majority looking to bulldoze over both groups. It's hard to kind of parse that out because we don't have a lot from the other voices to know, but the Jews get ransacked in Jerusalem in 1096 and the Muslims get ransacked. Both groups get brutalized pretty bad. And throughout the Crusades don't just stop in 1096, they keep going. There's a couple of them. What happens at the start of the Crusades is this ongoing level of hatred that develops from the Vatican. The Vatican, it becomes dogma for them. It becomes part of their faith that having a scapegoat is going to be really important. And it's just heartbreaking to see that this concept of the scapegoat, which in the Hebrew Bible was that story of Azazel, where the priest would go and have 2 goats. One goat they would offer up as a sacrifice, and they would have they'd eat that goat. The second goat they would put their sins on, and they would send that out as the Yom Kippur tribute. And that we kind of become that goat. We become the scapegoat for Catholic, the Catholic Church, and by extension for much of early Christianity. And it's just heartbreaking to see how we have become, in the metaphor of the goat, not human. And that's kind of like part of this, that For much of this, it is a sense of Jews being less than fully human, not deserving of a full sense of humanity. What we also see at this time, let's say 800, 900 years ago, is as different countries are navigating economic hardships, Jews go in and out of favor. So about 1100, the Jews are expelled from England, because at the time there was a lot of financial tumult, and Jews were blamed for the financial tumult. Why are the Jews blamed when the economy goes bad? The Jews were the money lenders. They were the middle managers. They were the traders and the bargainers. And they get blamed anytime the economy is bad. When the economy is good, life for the Jews gets better. So what we see is about 100 years later in England, the economy takes an upswing. Jews are welcomed back in. And they kind of go in and out of favor for a couple hundred years, where Jews are welcomed in England during good times, kicked out of England during bad times. It's also true in France as well. So part of this is just this weird notion that when we're looking for a scapegoat, the Jews are the easy scapegoat to kind of blame our problems on. Out of this comes a new story that Christians begin to tell about Jewish hatred, which is called the blood libel. Jews are blamed in the springtime when a young Christian child would die, like at a riverbank. Maybe they slipped and fell on the ice and cracked their head, or they fell into an ice pond. Somehow a young child dies in the spring. The story of how that's explained in the community is, oh, the Jews need blood for their Passover matzah. And they've got to take the blood of a Christian child to make the Passover matzah. How ridiculous is this story? Anyone who knows the laws of matzah and the laws of blood and how we must be separating our matzah and all of our food from any blood, human or otherwise, is so dramatic that the simple claim of it is absurd. But of course, the Jews aren't writing these. It's the Christian leaders who are trying to lay a blame, get another scapegoat to take care of their own problems. These blood libels continue on for centuries. They don't get disproven. They get published in one country, they pop up a century later in another country, and they continue on almost unchecked for 700 years. It's pretty phenomenal.
Which are the plays that they're doing in Germany all the time? I think they still continue them.
Yeah.
That's the bloodlust, right?
Well, the specific one is the Elders, the Protocol Design. We'll get to that in a few moments, but we're not quite. This is the basis for much of that. So that the Elders gets based on these blood libels. The extent of the anti-Semitism in the Vatican gets so dramatic that when Christianity overwhelms Muslim Spain and the Ottoman Empire around 1490, right before Columbus takes over, heads out in 1492, when Isabella becomes queen. She's rising as queen as the Catholic Church is becoming completely in control in Spain. That control of Spain will be a rejection of both Islam as well as the Jews. The Jews are forced to convert at that time. And so the Jews of not only Spain and Portugal, but all of North Africa, to survive, they must now convert or move. They've lost citizenship rights in 1492. And so what we see is this new migration of Jewish folks from Spain and Portugal to different areas in the region. They start moving through the Ottoman Empire, so they go to Turkey, go to Greece, they go to Italy. Sarah Suntimer, who was in this group last year, has been doing a lot of work on the Sephardi transition from Spain to Italy and how they've influenced Italy's and Italian Jews tremendously. They also wind up, interestingly enough, in Amsterdam. of all the places in Europe, Amsterdam kind of welcomes them in. And if we think of the Dutch being early colonialists, the Sephardi community creates a bit of a home base in Amsterdam in the early 1500s. And so that becomes like a haven of sorts for several thousand of the Sephardi community. The Jews of Spain are kind of on the run at this time, right? They're no longer comfortable, and so they're transitioning. And the Catholic Church has realized that this is a trump card that they can use whenever they need to get the Jews on the move. Yeah.
It's interesting how Isabel in American textbooks for grade school is always lauded for supporting Columbus, and none of this is ever
Oh,
mentioned.
well, of course, this isn't, this is the minority opinion, right? The next story I'll tell has got the same valence in our current concerns about the Ukraine, because what happens is that this religious anti-Semitism that's been developing by the Catholic Church morphs a little bit as it migrates into Europe. So the religious anti-Semitism of the Catholic Church doesn't go away, but it kind of shifts and changes as Russia and Poland navigate its group of Jews around 1650. So many of us have been reading up on the Ukrainian independence and how they historically have claimed this independence. Might have heard about the Cossacks and the Cossacks going in, and the name Cossack is a free man. So the free men are going in to liberate from Poland the Ukraine, so that they can feel like they have some independence. Unfortunately, when the Cossacks at the Khamniki massacres in 1648 are going out, they're attacking thousands and thousands of Jews who are working as money managers for the Poles. And they also attack thousands and thousands of Jews who are working as money managers for the Russians. And so these massacres, we're not sure how many died, somewhere between 10 and 50,000 Jews die in the Ukraine at this time from these ongoing massacres that continue over a couple of years. But what we see with these pogroms is this new wave of anti-Semitism that is moving not only from a religious argument, they killed Jesus so we can kill them, to a national argument. They're not really Russians, or they're not really Poles. They're Jewish. They have a different nationality. We need to set up a national argument, almost a racial argument against them. That is a shift in the nature of anti-Semitism, that Jews are not just of the wrong religion, but now they're of the wrong racial makeup. They're not white. They're not white enough. And that's a piece that American Jews don't always notice, that there's a racial component for the next couple hundred years to the pogroms that go on in Russia and Poland, as well as to how this leads as a starting point for Hitler's development of his own racialized anti-Semitism. So the Khamnitsky massacres begin an ongoing set of terrorist approaches towards the Jewish community at different times. It's not always bad, but at different times in Russia, we know certainly by the 1800s, it gets pretty bad there when the Tsar is having some struggles, and the Jews, the pogroms against the Jews in Eastern Europe get pretty terrible by the mid 1850s to the 1900s. What we also need to be aware of in this dynamic of national hatred or national anti-Semitism is in 1776, the United States grants citizenship to Jews alongside Protestants to become full citizens. And in France in 1792, Napoleon grants Jews who will become full Frenchmen, that if they reject their Jewish practice and become fully French, they can get full citizenship rights. So Western Europe kind of develops this new conversation about thinking of Jews as citizens. So from about 1792 on, in France, in the United States, to a certain degree in England, we begin to see a slight shift in this conversation about Jewish anti-Semitism, because if they can have citizenship rights, they can't be moved out in that kind of ethnic cleansing maneuver.
Could you go into it a little bit more in France? Because it sounds like what you're saying is similar to what happened in Spain. Don't be Jewish anymore to be a French citizen.
Sort of. The weirdness in Spain is different from the weirdness in France. The weirdness in Spain is based on the prominence of the Catholic Church. The weirdness in France during the 1800s is Napoleon isn't completely successful. At times there's an emperor, and at times there's a parliament, and they go back and forth, and there's a couple different revolutions. So for the next, I don't know, 50, 70 years, I'm not a French historian, the Jews kind of are marginalized, and then they're accepted and marginalized and sort of accepted. To some degree, it's kind of like what happens here in the United States, that the Jews in the 1800s are sort of accepted in parts of this country and sort of not accepted in parts of this country.
Are they supposed to like more French than Jewish and here more American than Jewish?
Sort of, yeah. And we can see in both places they're Protestant countries. So in that Protestant approach, that allows it to be a different kind of religious equilibrium.
You don't have the influence of the Roman Catholic Church, so that would make it a little bit more liberal.
Of course. But what I want to do is think about the Jews in Eastern Europe. If that's the nature of Western Europe, the Jews in Eastern Europe are poor. They're farmers. They're not educated. And they're almost living in a time warp. Modernity hasn't hit Poland, the Ukraine, Russia, the way it hits Paris and London and Berlin.
Is this because in Eastern Europe, they weren't allowed to live in the cities like they were in the West?
I don't know, maybe. It seems like the ghettoization of the Jews during this period is not as intense in Russia and Poland as it is, let's say, in Venice or in Germany, that the ghettoization, the Jews becoming the city dwellers and the urban folks, that when you want to box them in, you just put them in that ghetto lot and you kind of wall in the ghetto, doesn't seem to be as dramatic in the Russian-Polish encounter as it does in others.
What about Hungary though? Because Hungary was sort of part of the Enlightenment, you might say. The universities were second to none, and it was mostly Jewish scholars in them. And according to this, they're not so hot over there either.
Yeah, I don't know enough about Hungary to speak dramatically, except from Wiesel's writings. I don't know enough about Hungary's intersection with modernity to know that in the 1850s, most of Western Europe was now going to universities to get educated. In Russia and in Poland, most folks weren't going to universities. It was still a very medieval experience compared to the Enlightenment going on in Western Europe.
Not so much a question, just I think the Jews in Hungary and stuff was mostly the Hungarians already were seen as second class to the Austrians and the Russian influence and the Turks. So they had bigger issues than
And part of this also with Hungary is the role of the Ottoman Empire, that where the Ottoman Empire maintains itself, Jews have a different relationship to citizenship rights inside the Ottoman Empire than they do in Christian Europe. So that's another way to think about that. Okay, in the 1800s, late 1800s, Jews begin migrating out of Russia and the horrors of the pogroms. I know that's where my great-grandparents lived. And they come to the United States. My great-grandfather told a great story to me when I was a kid. He said when he was 12 years old, when he was 12, Joy, I'm gonna have to mute you. I'm gonna ask folks to stay mute for a bit because some of the sounds bleeding through. Anyway, when my great-grandfather was 12, he was told to board a train to Moscow and report to the Russian army for 25 years of service. That was the tour of duty if you were a Jewish person in Russia. And instead of heading east to Moscow, he heads west and leaves the country. And his grandfather, who had migrated out to Boston, paid for his passage, and he leaves for the United States. This is around 1900. And the stories he tells of the pogroms in Kiev were pretty terrible, pretty awful. He didn't have many happy experiences as a 12-year-old, thinking back to life there. Between 1880 and 1924, over 2 million Jews leave. It's a lot of folks, right? We've witnessed, just in the Ukrainian war, already 4 million have left, right? It's almost that level of desperation that we've got hundreds and thousands of Jews leaving on a regular basis for 40 years from Eastern Europe. Now, what we can also think about is that Warsaw, Poland, which was a huge city alongside Kiev and Moscow, the numbers of Jews that probably lived in those urban centers was probably tremendous. Probably maybe a third to half of the population were Jewish. And so we can only imagine that the culture and the language and the behaviors of these European urban centers was deeply influenced by the Jews that were there with the Yiddish theater and the Yiddish music and so on. So the loss is profound. It's a dramatic loss as Jews begin exiting.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I've thought to ask this many times, but I'm remembering now. And that is, how did Yiddish, which is basically like German, how did that get to be so predominant in the Eastern sections?
So it's a good question. Yiddish becomes very early on, I want to say maybe 1,000 years ago, the language that business folks use to exchange business. So they're also using Hebrew, but as the more devout religious folks are privileging the use of Yiddish, which is a German dialect, over the holy language, Yiddish becomes what is taught in schools. So in the yeshivas and in the small educational centers, the children learn Yiddish. Doesn't matter if they're in Poland, Russia, Germany, France, they're learning Yiddish. Because Yiddish will be the language where they can talk in everyday language. It's the mama lashon, like the mother tongue. Hebrew is also taught, but Hebrew is not spoken. So Hebrew is taught as a prayer language. And remember, everyone there is trilingual, at least, if not more. So learning extra languages isn't so hard. But Yiddish is this German Hebrew blend that somehow gets wildly influential, not only in Germany, but perhaps even much of Russia. And so it's a really interesting piece that it is as transitory, that it really develops legs and it goes well beyond the German boundaries for Yiddish to be so, in so much so that when the Russian Revolution hits in 1919 and they set up an academy for the Jews, it's an academy based on Yiddish theater and Yiddish language and Yiddish literature, right? And that's happening in Moscow. Right? So thinking about that in Moscow, they're spending government funds on Yiddish language and Yiddish art in 1919 is just this phenomenal piece. I saw another hand over here a few moments ago.
I've been scratching.
Okay, all right.
Rabbi,
Yeah, go ahead.
so, but the other thing that was interesting about Yiddish is that not only did the Jews speak Yiddish, but at least in Poland, and I think in much of Russia, they did not speak the local vernacular. Like my grandparents' family, the only person in my great-grandparents' family who spoke Polish was my great-grandmother. She had a small business and she needed to interact with the Poles, but all of the rest of them only spoke Yiddish.
That might be different in different communities, Amy. I don't know enough about that dynamic, but my sense is in the urban centers where Jews were doing a lot of, let's say, mid-level management, they were the middle class folks. If they were multilingual, they probably also picked up Polish and Russian as well. Whether they preferred to use it or not, it's a whole other question. But I do know that many folks in the urban centers seem to have been multilingual. And some of the folks in the rural in the rural areas that were, let's say, farmers, didn't have that specific need. So I think that was kind of a case by case if you were kind of doing some farming work or if you were more in the trades and, you know.
Well, my
selling
family
stuff.
was in a shtetl, so they were a pretty rural
Yeah,
location
yeah,
outside
it's a fascinating dynamic.
Krakow.
There's plenty of other situations too. My brother-in-law's parents were Polish. They spoke Polish. I don't think they spoke Yiddish whatsoever, but he was a professional. He was a judge. He was also a communist pre-World War II. That made him doubly vulnerable for some things. So I think it all depends on the level of education and, of course, as we said, the location.
But that was also 50 years later, Len.
So in this Russian environment, what happens next that's really important to be aware of in the history of anti-Semitism is this little book that gets published around, I think, 1880, maybe 1870, thereabouts. It is The Elders of the Protocol of Zion. And this is a small blasphemous treaty based on how the Jews are using these ritual blood libels to make their Passover matzahs. It seems it's Russian propaganda that's written at a time where they're trying to get the Jews to continue to emigrate out. But it has legs. It gets very popular in the Ottoman Empire, in the Muslim communities. It gets very popular in China and in Japan, where they get a copy of it, who knows how. And they decide to take that as the gospel truth instead of actually finding out like why it would be a fabrication. So it's a really interesting dynamic that this small propaganda piece becomes Bible, becomes doctrine,
It
becomes
makes great horror theater.
phenomenal the way it has been so well revered, accepted. And so because it is still published in some corners of the world, we have to continue to be aware of it and know that people are still using it for various ideas. Okay. What all this does is it gives Adolf Hitler a very interesting tapestry to work from in the 1920s as he is getting out of World War I and he is trying to imagine what is going to be the future of Germany. What he does is he thinks about the shift in anti-Semitism from religious anti-Semitism to this racialized anti-Semitism or nationalized anti-Semitism. And he puts that whole model on steroids. He just blows that up and he comes up with this amazing point that Jews need to be exterminated. The final solution must be to get rid of the Jews. And it doesn't matter anymore about religious ideas anymore. It doesn't matter if they're practicing Jewish stuff. It only matters that their grandparent, one of their grandparents was Jewish. That's enough to write them basically a death certificate that they should be killed. And so for Hitler, it becomes a doctrine of racism. And that has to be a very important part of this before we get into the Holocaust is that for the Nazis, their hatred of Judaism was racialized. These folks weren't white. And the same issue that we saw with the Russian government, that they were dangers to the nation. They weren't really Russian. Will be the same dangers that they'll have for the Germans. This kind of racial hatred, as you know, in the last couple of years, as we've been looking at anti-racism and looking at how racism in this country has been so prevalent and so hard to uproot, what we're also seeing is scholar after scholar looking at the history of racism and seeing that the history of racism always starts with the Jews. And that's a really sobering but important part of this. That if you hate the blacks, you also hate the Jews. And so when we're encountering white nationalists today or white supremacists today, they hate both groups, if not more. They hate yellow folks and brown folks and black folks, and the Jews are kind of the kings of the kingmakers in that, in their demonology of this. So part of this is a very, very difficult but important part of looking at anti-Semitism alongside racism. And that when Hitler in 1933, 1934 is developing ways to legalize hatred of the Jews, he turns to our laws in the Deep South against the blacks and says, you know, look at what they did in America. We can do that. We can borrow from this. We can figure out how to marginalize our people just like they marginalize their people. Fascinating dynamic that Hitler is getting expertise on how to increase his hatred by looking at what the Americans did to the Afro-Americans in the South. Gordon, quick, and then Len.
I've heard a lot of people say that the fear of communism and the Soviet Union was also a big factor in igniting anti-Semitism in
Okay.
Germany.
So let's talk about that from this. It's a really important piece of this. If we're thinking of this time frame from 1880 to 1925, when Russia's going through the Russian proletariats, and right, this is the birth of communism. There are many Jews who are communists. There are many Jews who are socialists. There are many Jews who are on the other side fighting against the communists as well. But because there is this sympathy for the common man, and thinking that if somehow the common man or the helping all the folks might also help the Jews. But if we think like why American Jews are so dedicated and devoted to democracy, it floats all the boats. If communism can float all the boats, why don't the Jews just become cheerleaders for that? And they do. So because of the anti-Semitism that so many folks experience, communism becomes somehow in vogue in many Jewish communities. In America, we see this most in the workers' unions in the turn of the century, 1900, 1910, 1920, that many of those socialist endeavors to make the workers' rights stronger and more vibrant come from this push for early forms of both socialism and communism. So it's a fair critique that Jews are part of this philosophical idea, so much so that we know next week when we study about Israel, when Israel is born, one of its main endeavors is the kibbutz movement, a socialist endeavor to have a socialist utopia that will exist alongside the government's, democratic ideals. So it's a really interesting tapestry to acknowledge that many of the secular Jews in this country 100 years ago were Reds, or they were working at the worker, they were part of a workman's circle in the as the Yiddishists doing workers' rights at the unions and at the various garment industries and such.
David has had his hand up for a while.
Thank you. David, go ahead. David, take yourself off of mute.
When Hitler started his horrible campaign, very conveniently, he had a lot of backers who were ultra right-wing people that were champions of business. They owned a lot of businesses and everything, and they were very anti-Semitic. But one of the things that fueled Hitler was he stole lots and lots of money from Jews, and that fueled him. He just took all the Jewish people that he destroyed's money, and that kept that was a very positive reinforcement for him. It was a considerable amount of money, and that kept him going for a long time. And that
Let me
was
talk about Yeah,
That
David,
wasn't-
let me add to your point to say that in 1936, the other piece of Hitler's program was the propaganda piece. And he learns a lot about propaganda in the 36 Olympics. This is the Jesse Owens Olympics, where Jesse Owens wins 4 gold medals as an African-American, and the Jews are completely forced out. The Jews aren't allowed to compete during those games. And it becomes such a shining example of Nazi propaganda that the filmmaker, I'm forgetting her name.
Wertmüller?
Huh?
Wertmüller?
Yeah, I think so, Lonnie Wertmüller. She starts making documentaries about how amazing the German Renaissance is under Hitler in the 1930s. And so what we begin to see for a look back in Nazi Germany is that the use of the money and the propaganda are all part of these political ploys, these levers that they put in. Now, the other thing that happens about this time in 36 is an alliance with the Pope. And Hitler says, hey, Pope, we need a friendship. We need to make sure. And remember, all those blood libels are still going on. And so the Pope in the 30s has an alliance with Hitler. And it is a very problematic situation that the Catholic Church is in bed with Nazi Germany for much of the war.
I was just curious about what the attitude might have been. The Holocaust also consumed, well, destroyed, I guess consumed would work, lots of gypsies and homosexuals. But my guess is that Hitler needed a huge, huge target, and those two groups weren't big enough.
Yeah,
The
right.
Jews were.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So they're part of that marginalized group. They're just an expansion of the folks you can marginalize.
Just not enough of them.
Amy, go ahead, and then we'll have Ezra share the timeline with us. We'll read through that.
So, but it's interesting, in terms of what you say about the Pope. It's also true that the Catholic Church, at the level of nuns and priests and such, they also were highly, active in protecting Jews, hiding
Sure.
children.
Yeah, I don't want to, I want to kind of put us like in 1936 mindset. There are thousands of Catholic priests and nuns who saved Jews. But I want to do, before we kind of get to like the fullness of this picture, Ezra is going to share a timeline for us. And we're going to walk through this timeline of the Holocaust. This is a document from mygewishlearning.com, and they're just a really good resource for good basic Judaism 101 type of material. So as Ezra calls this up, I just want to kind of move through this together, and we can kind of mostly read the headlines. We won't read the entire, all the data of the doc, but we'll just kind of move through from one headline to the next. So Ezra, I'm going to ask you to scroll down because we're actually kind of get to about 1937 or 38. We see that here, this is where Hitler comes to power, the 36 Olympics, as I mentioned. And this is a good start. So we can start with Germany annexes Austria in 38. And if you scroll on down, to the next one, we can kind of walk through the rest of this timeline together. So we get the Munich Agreement. Let's pause here at Kristallnacht for a moment. We'll kind of read through Kristallnacht. So if you could scroll down to the text under Kristallnacht. Len, why don't you, can you read that, the night of violent?
I can, and I will.
Okay.
A night of violent anti-Jewish pogroms known as Kristallnacht results in the destruction of hundreds of synagogues, the looting of thousands of Jewish-owned businesses, and the deaths of nearly 100 Jews. The event, which was followed by the promulgation of dozens of anti-Jewish laws, is considered a turning point in the persecution of German Jewry.
So this is really the term Kristallnacht means the night of broken glass. The Jewish shops throughout the city were destroyed. Hundreds and thousands of Torah scrolls were desecrated that night. Every synagogue in Berlin was ransacked. Just a devastating experience.
The crazy thing, and I wrote an article like about that for our old Megillah that was on paper instead of online, is that it gives you an illusion in your head when you hear crystal mouth that it must have been beautiful. All these broken pieces of glass reflecting light. It's just a gorgeous light show.
Yeah.
And it's not.
Ezra, if you could scroll down to the next one, this is another important one to be aware of, which is the kinder transports begin in 38. The kinder transports, the term here means the children, the little children, right? Kinder are the 5-year-olds, the little babies that are being trained out of Berlin. My wife Rachel, her mom's mom was on one of those kinder transports out of Austria. And so thousands and thousands of young people were transferred out of Austria and Germany to mostly, I think, England. Many of these kids wind up in England before they either get relocated there or shipped across to the United States. Ezra, go ahead, scroll down to the next one for us. The departure of the St. Louis, this is one worth chatting about for a minute. So the St. Louis this is the famous movie, The Voyage of the Damned, right? It's a boat filled with Jews. And the boat goes first to Cuba and Puerto Rico and different places in the Caribbean, and they're all turned away. This is 1938. Remember, backtrack, 1924, the immigration laws closed down. Those 44 years of open immigration end in 1924. We don't want any more of those foreigners coming in to take jobs away from us. That doesn't sound familiar, or same thing. We closed down the borders in 24. So in 38, when the borders need to be reopened in a desperate measure, a boat is sent out filled with hundreds of Jews, and no one takes them. Scroll to the next one.
Did the United States ever eventually become embarrassed by that?
I don't know. I don't know if the United States is ever embarrassed. We just make mistakes. So Germany invades Poland in 1939. This is September. And why don't we scroll down? Germany then goes on to invade France. So in May of 40, Auschwitz is established, and let's kind of read the text for that, Ezra, if you can set that up for us. Germany establishes the Auschwitz concentration camp, the largest facility of its kind, built by the Nazis, 43 miles west of Krakow, Poland. Over 1 million Jews will die there. Another word about the final solution, as we kind of get into this conversation. The Nazis had a strategy for how to get rid of the Jews. The final solution didn't just have the endpoint, it also had a lot of steps along the way. So it started with ghettoization, right? The Jews were taken out of their homes and they were put in deep concentrated ghettos. So 3 or 4 or 5 families sharing one apartment. And then the ghettos were hemmed in, they were fenced in. Think of the Warsaw Ghetto being like a good example of this. So thousands or tens of thousands of Jews living in a very concentrated area. Once that group is completely gathered in together, then you take the group itself and you transport the group to a work camp. You need a work camp because the work camp will be the slave labor that your army can run on. And so for a couple of years, the work camps seem to be as bad as it gets. People are going to survive if they can work until they don't, because at the work camps, they're not getting fed. They're living on about 100 calories a day, or maybe 500 calories a day, like a crust of bread and a potato. The work camps are there to, as a fuel, like they can do the dirty work of war, but what they realize is that that's not enough. We have to begin the exterminations, and that's going to be the next part of this. Kate, go ahead.
It's interesting how most people associate the word ghetto as being Warsaw Ghetto and the Holocaust, and they forget it started in Italy.
Yeah, that's why I mentioned the Venice Ghetto earlier on. Scroll on down, Ezra, we've got the Warsaw Ghetto confined in 1940. 350,000 Jews are there. And then Germany invades Russia in 41. If we can move on down, we'll get to a couple more about the concentration camps themselves. So in 41, it's the wearing of the yellow stars, and every Jew in Germany is forced to wear a yellow star that shows that they are outsiders. They're not part of the pure German race.
Oh, so it's not just an armband.
Pearl Harbor in 41. And here we get January of 42, the final solution. This is the Wannsee Conference. Why don't you scroll to the text and we can read that. The Wannsee Conference convenes in a villa outside Berlin. Plans to coordinate a final solution to the Jewish question are presented to leading German and Nazi officials, and it is overwhelmingly approved. If you wanted to watch the video about this, it's worthwhile. It's just a chilling idea that at the Wannsee Conference, what they unveil is the idea of gas chambers, that if they set up not showers, but gas, Zyklon B gas, that can exterminate the Jews quicker, it'll certainly be much more expeditious than spending a bullet to kill a Jew. So for the last couple of years, by 1942, they have been killing millions of Jews in the Ukraine. 1.5 million Jews are dying by bullet. The Babi Yar stuff is going on about this time. And what Hitler decides at the Wannsee Conference is it's too expensive. Jews aren't worth bullets. We need to find a much cheaper way to exterminate the Jews, not only cheaper, but faster. We need to kill a lot of them fast. And if we gas them all at once, it's going to be much, much more efficient than killing one at a time.
Remind us that that's the one in the glass booth that was brought back to Israel for trial.
Yeah.
What's his name again?
I'm not.
Eichmann, right.
Okay, Ezra, if you could scroll on down. Ezra, go ahead and scroll down. The Nazis begin the gassing in Treblinka in 42, and we get the ghetto uprising. We don't get many ghetto uprisings, but in 43 there's one. And so for several months, the Jews in Warsaw held off the feared German army, and it was surprisingly successful. It was coordinated, and this is the one of the very few times where Jewish vigilantes, Jewish armed groups of people took to arms to defend themselves. Yeah, devastating that this wasn't more frequent. Go ahead, Ezra, scrolling down to the next one. So we have Germany occupying Hungary in 44, and this is kind of where we get started with Elie Wiesel's book, right? He starts in 44 with, he's living in Siget, and Siget they should have made it out. It's like 1944, right? They should have no longer been part of this, but Transylvania and the rest of Hungary get swept up at the very end, and they get rushed through the Nazi death machine.
Did the Germans take many, I mean, they were active in Russia. Did they export then Jews that were in Russia to these camps, or?
No, no. The Jews that were dying in Russia, they left for the Poles to deal with in the Ukraine. The Jews that they dealt with here were kind of the territories that they were conquering. So they didn't need to deal with the Russian and Polish Jews because they were imprisoned in work camps primarily. And those work camps turned into ongoing Russian work camps after the war. So it's not like the Russians were so wonderfully thrilled to have, poor Jews on their doorstep. It's another level of the terror that, thousands and thousands of those Russian Jews will die after the war as well. Let's do a few more, Ezra, and then we'll kind of bring it back together. prisoners at Auschwitz rebel in 44. And the Soviets liberate Auschwitz in 45. So this is the first image of liberation. And Hitler dies in April of 45. The war is just about coming to an end at this point, and the liberation of the concentration camps continues. I want to do one more, as we can do this. Germany surrenders in 45. That's a good place to wrap this up. And then I want to kind of do a quick addendum. So as you finish the share screen, let's come back together as a group. And I want to share one last Holocaust story with you. This happened in 1946, so a year later, maybe a year and a half after, in a town called Kielce, Poland. Kielce was a tiny town in Poland. So a year and a half, 2 years after the end of the war, a couple hundred Jews returned to Kielce, Poland to see what's left. And the Poles killed them all. The war is over. And they killed them all.
That could have also been because they didn't want to give back property.
I met one of the Kent State students, had grandparents from Kielce, Poland. And he was on a trip to Poland while he was a student. And they went to Kielce. Very powerful, very
What kind of
powerful.
reception did they get?
What's that?
What kind of reception did they get?
They're
This is way post-war.
money coming into the Polish government. Amy, go ahead.
So to me, one of the real horrors of World War II was that even after the full extent of the concentration camp catastrophe was widely known by the world still did not reach out to the Jews and accept them. They put them in refugee camps and kept them there for years while people were unable to reunite with their loved ones. I mean, the United States did allow some people in. My first husband's family came in right after the war, but they had relatives here that sponsored them. You had to be sponsored. But the rest of these survivor groups largely languished in terrible, terrible conditions. And we look at what's happening with Ukrainians today, and the world is being pressured to open their arms to them wide. And I have to say, as much as I feel confident, that what they're going through is terrible, the Ukrainian refugees that we see are largely well-dressed and well-groomed, and and they're being taken care of as soon as they step across the border into Poland.
Aaron, go ahead.
Well, I was just kind of thinking, just because the Holocaust happened, I mean, anti-Semitism is still everywhere. Like, it's not just going to go away. And I put it in the chat. In 1939, in Madison Square Garden, there was a Nazi rally. You can watch a video of it. It's a little short documentary. It's called A Night at the Garden. Of course, they're not going to be opening arms to Jews all over the world because they still don't like us. I mean, the anti-Semitism didn't just disappear. Like, it's still there. You know what I mean?
So Aaron, let me complicate that a little bit because I mostly agree with you. And what I want to say is that from about 1950 on, it does get better here. I think if we start reading Harry Truman's journals and his articles about why Truman supports the state of Israel, Harry Truman and by extension, the American government is feeling deeply guilty, feeling deeply guilty for what happened, and they don't quite know what to do. So one of the American responses to the Holocaust is a really strong support for the birth of the state of Israel, right? That was not an evident forecast that we could have predicted before the Holocaust. So I don't like to always say that one thing leads to another, that the Holocaust is a direct cause of the state of Israel, because two different events in two different parts of the world. But one of the ways that we deal with this tremendous refugee crisis is by having the birth of this new Jewish state that can at least house these poor folks who are in terrible, terrible conditions, and no one in the world wants them, right? The Poles don't want them, the Russians don't want them, and so it becomes an emergency situation to deal with the refugee crisis. David, go ahead.
Yeah, the truth is absolutely this, that when the state of Israel was being formed, David Ben-Gurion was the president. The United States State Department was so anti-Semitic, they didn't want Israel to be successful. And Harry Truman's business partner was Jewish. And while he was president from 1945 on, his business partner never talked to him. He didn't feel like it was important to use his influence with Harry Truman. So he stayed away. But one time he came and he said, Harry, talk to David Ben-Gurion, and he wants me to talk to you about recognizing the state of Israel. This was a book written by Joe Scarborough, a Morning Joe on MSNBC. And he said it took 17 minutes for Harry Truman to decide. And he told the State Department, we're recognizing Israel. And they were really upset with Harry Truman. They really didn't want him to recognize the state of Israel. But this, he was very influenced by his ex-business partner. So the United States really didn't have a real good feeling that they wanted to help Israel out. They didn't want it at all. They were against the state of Israel. But Harry Truman had a soft spot for his business partner, and he's the one that did it.
Hey, David, well said. Well said. What I'll say, just to kind of add a tiny bit, because we're going to dive into Israeli history next week. So we'll kind of go into the details of some of this in our readings and our conversation next week. But for the first 20 years of Israel's existence, from 1948 to 1967, America is pretty lukewarm. They like Israel, okay, but they really could care less. It's not till the 6-Day War where America really sees that supporting the state of Israel as a democracy is good political strategy against the Russian-backed Muslim countries, Egypt and Saudi Arabia and so on. And so for that reason, we see America really dive into its relationship with the United States right around 1967. And since then, it's been very, very strong ever since. But it's a good point, David, that for those first 20 years, it's sometimes okay, sometimes not. And it's never so terribly friendly over all the nuts and bolts of that. Len, go ahead.
Moving towards or through those 20 years, though, I think the biggest supporters were probably American Jews. And the thing that happened in 67 was they won a war and proved that they could be a nation.
So we'll continue that conversation next week. What I want to focus in on today is the role of anti-Semitism in our lives. And so I'm going to ask Ezra to kind of put us into some breakout groups. And I'm going to ask a very specific kind of breakout conversation. I'm asking for born Jews to talk about the role of anti-Semitism and the role of the Holocaust and the memory of the Holocaust as part of our Jewish identity. And so Ezra is going to put us together in groups. I'll work with my group here. And what I want you to do in your breakout groups is really hear from the people who were born Jews to just say, what was it like to grow up in the shadow of the Holocaust? How did anti-Semitism or the Holocaust impact your life as a Jew in America? And so that's going to be our focus for the next 5 minutes. And Ezra, I'm going to allow you to kind of partner up folks here, and I'm going to take care of the group that we've got going.
Well, I certainly learned about it. Oops.
All right, so thank you for everyone coming back together. There's so much to say. We could really go for hours and hours on this conversation. And I want to just kind of pick up a couple points, but I'm gonna start, Ezra, with what did you get to hear in your experiences? And let's hear a little bit from what was going on in some of the other rooms.
Yeah, so I hopped around in a few different rooms, and in a lot of rooms, in multiple different rooms, I heard these themes of some of the older people on this call talking about how their generation or their parents' generation was just absolutely devastated and just never really emotionally recovered from the Holocaust or from losing people, as well as this theme of always being ready to run and feeling like it can always happen here. You need to have your passports ready to go, and you need to have transferable job skills. And I know those are feelings that get passed down to the younger generation as well. Lots of Jews my age sleep with their passports next to their bed. And then I heard also from the younger generation talking about the Holocaust didn't feel as present, but anti-Semitism certainly did, and what the lived experience of like anti-Semitism in a post-Holocaust world looked like.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted a couple different directions to go in, but the first one that I want to tap on is the idea of what do we do with God after the Holocaust? And so because we are living in that dynamic of being in a connection to a Jewish community after the Holocaust, what we can begin to say is the Jewish perspective of God after the Holocaust has to change. And it does, it dramatically does. So much so that, if you think about the role of Santa Claus and that idea of if you're a good boy or girl on Christmas, you're going to get the goodies for leading a good life. That concept of a personal God taking care of you if you do the right thing, or punishing you if you do the wrong thing, that God dies. And you have to be completely blunt about that. Jews no longer have room for a personal God. It's just not a luxury that we can ever engage in, because there was no personal God saving the Jews during the Holocaust. How many died? 2/3 or a third of all Jews died. So 6 million of the 18 million that were alive pre-World War II. In the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic community, 90%. 90% of their community dies. It's devastating. Absolutely devastating. There's a couple amazing philosophers who write beautifully about ideas of God after the Holocaust. I'm just going to highlight a few of them just to be aware of them. And so Emil Fackenheim comes up with the idea of a 614th commandment. Right, that there's 613 commandments that Jews are supposed to follow these laws. And the 614th, the only one that should survive the Holocaust, is we don't give Hitler a victory. We make Jewish babies. We have to survive. We must survive and not give Hitler a posthumous victory. And that becomes a very charged and important and strained way to feel like you're obligated to do Jewish in the 50s and the 60s. But it becomes, I think, for many, a pained version of their Jewish expression, that they have to do Jewish, not because they want to, but because they can't give Hitler a victory.
Is that sort of like a Jewish version of don't get revenge, get even?
Maybe. The other piece I want to say is that a few other Holocaust philosophers, theologians, come up with an idea about God in relationship, that Martin Buber's I and thou becomes a way to say, all right, if we can't trust the individual any longer, because we don't know which individual is going to feel so self-aggrandized that they're simply going to want to control the world, like we're watching with Putin right now. We then have to trust relationships. We have to trust how we can be in relationship with others. And we have to figure out how to locate a sense of holiness in relationships. And so Martin Buber talks about this a lot, as does Franz Rosenzweig, also a few others. But this idea of moving out of the individual and more into the relational becomes another way for Jews to begin to think about a philosophical idea that is no longer based on what the individual can do, but more based on the relational or the communal. There's a lot more to be said. We'll get to other philosophical ideas in contemporary Jewish thought when we have our couple sessions at the end. But this is just a marker to say that Jewish ideas about prayer, about tradition, about having a blind faith no longer fly after the Holocaust. We have to have a reason to do Jewish. And that reason becomes Jewish community. It becomes for a variety of other reasons, to celebrate our holidays, to celebrate our families. And so we kind of move from that Fackenheim model, the negative construction identity, to a positive one, but that takes, I think, several decades.
Rabbi,
I want to check, yeah, go ahead, Amy.
I just wanted to ask you that whether you think that all of that you just said about that there's no way the Jews can hold on to the concept of a personal God. Do you think that that's really the way that the very Orthodox would still see that? Or is that more?
I think absolutely not, right. I think the Chabad, if I had Chabad folks here in the Zoom call with us, the Chabad rabbi would say he has a deep personal relationship with God, and God is answering his prayers. And then if we had to be transparent about it, what he would say is that the Messiah arrived for Chabad in 1995, and the Messiah has saved the world.
1995?
The Messiah is Schneerson, and Schneer, all we have to do is believe in Schneerson's redemptive qualities that will be saved, right? So we have a whole new messianic movement that is part of Chabad Hasidut, that or ultra-Orthodox. It's not so much a part of the other ultra-Orthodox communities. But if we're being very specific, the tiny group of people that still have that personal relationship really are in a very fraught place with ideas about modernity, right? They're not, it's very hard for them to figure out how to understand non-Jews in the world and the role of non-Jews in the world and their own Jewish experience. So it's a very complicated place. I would say for Orthodox Jews, go ahead, Amy, hang on. For Orthodox Jews, I would say that perspective on God has dramatically changed. That for traditionally observant folks, they may have a deep connection to prayer and a deep connection to God and to Jewish law, but if we were being very honest with them, they wouldn't say that they're going to have a God that is really going to help them any more than it helped their family get through a Holocaust situation. I would say that they would have a very different perspective of God being perhaps limited, a God that can have some impact on humanity, but a limited impact. And Yitz Greenberg is kind of the guy to go to on this. Yitz Greenberg is an Orthodox rabbi with Klal in New York City, and he has written eloquently about God constraining God's self over time, so that now human endeavor, human empowerment has been so dramatic that as humans get more powerful, as Jews get more powerful, God contracts God's self to give room for human agency. And that's like another way to think about that traditional perspective of God being different after the Holocaust. Okay, other questions or comments? Go ahead, Jill.
Did you say that Chabad Orthodox Jews believe that Schneerson is the Messiah?
Yeah, I'll be a bit more specific on that comment, George, because I don't want to be misstated. I would say about half of Chabad Lubavitch, which is ultra-Orthodox, I would say about half of them seem to be supporters of that idea, and about half of them seem to not support that idea. So
Because I
if you
don't
go
know
to-
any. Yeah.
So if you kind of dive deep into their community and get a sense of how they navigate it, I haven't asked specifically the Sasankan family, so I don't know how they specifically individually talk about this, but I have seen some gestures from some of their family that seem to think of Schneerson as being almost a saint, a tzaddik, a righteous individual that is, one of the shining lights. And I think he was a great rabbi. I don't want to diminish Schneerson's rabbinic work whatsoever.
I agree with what you just said. But I don't think that they see him as a Messiah because they are messianic when you go to any of their Torah studies or classes. We do talk about a Messiah, but I never heard them talk about Schneerson and Messiah in the same sentence.
Yeah, they're very careful to not blur that, and that's intentional. They know that they will be ridiculed, and so they can only intimate that privately among themselves. So one thing you should know about all traditionally observant people, whether they're Chabad or other Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox folks, there's a difference between people who are born Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox and people that become new believers later in life. And so these ideas that when they're in a community, they have a different conversation with people who are frum from birth or Orthodox from birth than they have with people who are new to the community. And they know that that's kind of a way of parsing their language. So I don't want to kind of speak out of turn because none of them are here to present themselves. And what I can do is just turn to the great literature that's been written in the last 10 years or so about the Lubavitch movement, both from people inside the movement and academics that have studied the movement. But this is not a conversation only about Chabad. So I want to kind of bracket that, put it to the side, and kind of bring it back to the rest of the group. We're kind of running a little bit low on time. And we didn't even talk about modern day anti-Semitism. So what I want to do is we're gonna come back to that in a couple of weeks. When we wrap this class up, we're gonna have a special section on contemporary issues. And the contemporary issue I want to bring out in that class will be, what do we do with this resurrection of anti-Semitism in the last 5 years, specifically the Pittsburgh shooting that happened, 3.5 years ago, the Poway shooting that happened 6 months later, the Colleyville attack that happened only 3 months ago. How are we supposed to understand that kind of anti-Semitic behavior in light of this? And what I want to say for a few moments is, after World War II in America, in the suburbanization of America in the 50s, we did see a great acceptance of a Judeo-Christian normativity. The Jews and the Christians and the Catholics all were kind of welcomed into this new American tent of saying that everyone can contribute to America. And that kind of anxiety and guilt about the Holocaust was a way to marginalize anti-Semitism to the far extremes for quite a while. And we only really saw that kind of anti-Semitic behavior primarily from people that were having other racial expressions of hatred, which was primarily in the South. So folks in the South probably had much more encounter with anti-Semitic behavior because they were encountering a much more racial behavior. It wasn't hidden. And so part of this, going back to Aaron's earlier comment, was it did continue, but I think it was also hidden to a great extent or marginalized, marginalized to the fringes until our last president got elected. And then he brought all those margins to the mainstream conversation, and he empowered those margins to kind of speak and have a megaphone that they'd never had before. And so perhaps that anti-Semitism that we've seen in the last 5 years is really a part of that weirdness of what's going on the extreme right, and how we have allowed their voices to be over amplified. Okay, enough of that for now. We'll get back
It
to
certainly
that.
wasn't hidden though up until the 60s with the KKK, that's for sure.
Well, sure, right, and the KKK, right, so going back to that Southern agenda, where you had expressions of racial hatred, you also had expressions of anti-Semitism. Homework for this week is to read about Israel. So in Essential Judaism, we've got a nice section about Israel. Also in a Book of Life, there is a chapter on Israel. So let's spend the week reading about the next historical piece, which is after the Holocaust, what happens to the Jewish formation of a Jewish state. And we'll spend next week talking about Israel. Before I answer Len's question, I want to say two things. The reason we're spending this time on these two moments is after the Passover holiday, the week after is Yom HaShoah, commemoration, remembrance of the Holocaust. And then a week later are the two Israel holidays about Yom HaAtzmaut and Yom HaZikaron, Israel Memorial Day and Israel Independence Day. So if we think that there's a rhythm of Jewish time now, we're going to have a week of Passover, and then we're going to have three big Israel holidays about these historic moments. That's kind of the trajectory, right? We're getting ready for these spring holidays, and they're all going to be coming one after another. And so that's kind of the rhythm that I'm in here to kind of get us ready for that. Before I ask, we're at 5:31, so anyone that needs to leave can. Anyone that wants to hang out for 5 minutes to answer questions is welcome to. So thank you for folks that need to leave. And Len, you can offer.
Yeah, I certainly have thoughts about this. I put in a lot of time reading it. Will we be discussing it?
We won't dive too deep into more, but in that next conversation about anti-Semitism, we could connect some stuff there in the conversation if you want to hold it for that.
Okay.
Yeah. If you want to share a thought, you can share a thought.
I will share a thought if I could now. I read this many decades ago, so long ago, I don't remember when. And as I read through it, I started it last night and finished it this afternoon. And as I read it, it was familiar, but not inside my memory.
Yeah.
And I got to say, by the end of the book,
What are you talking about, Len?
He's
The book
holding it
Night.
back.
Night.
Oh,
The camera's there.
There.
Len, the camera's there.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of cameras, so, yeah. So when I finished this, it was probably one of only 2 times. Tears were brought to my eyes 2 times, this book and the end of Bambi, the movie.
There's several. It's a very powerful story because he's very young when he writes this, right? He's a young man when he's coming with his thoughts. One quick comment about.
It seems implausible too, as you read it. How could it happen?
Elie Wiesel starts off his book Night as an ultra-Orthodox Jew. He's not part of Chabad, but he's part of a different ultra-Orthodox community in Siget. He finishes the book and he has a very strained relationship with God, right? He's no longer a deep believer by the end of that book. He's a Jew and he's going to be a practicing Jew and a praying Jew, but his relationship with God is strained by the end of the book. Go ahead, David.
In my lifetime, I think I've been exposed to about 3 or 4 anti-Semitic people. I don't think I could be offended by somebody saying anti-Semitic things to me. It wouldn't be offensive to me. I would just laugh it off.
I think with time we've got the luxury of that to hear the weirdness of that. And as a clergy person, I'll just kind of close this with the story I shared in my own breakout room here. That 5 years ago, when I was in North Carolina, I saw for the first time in my life anti-Semitism that I never expected to see. This is actually 6 years ago, the year before Trump was elected. I had moved, I was working at a conservative synagogue in Greensboro, North Carolina, and we got a lot of crank hate mail. Like that is just, North Carolina, there's a lot of folks who don't like Jews and they want to tell the Jews that they don't like them. But we got one letter that was a little bit different than the rest. It wasn't just "we hate you, you should go." Next to our synagogue is a small Jewish day school where my son was in preschool at the time. And the letter was very specific. It said, "We're going to start with the kids next door at the day school. We're going to kill them first. Then we'll come after you guys." That got our attention, right? We called the FBI on that and we said, "Hey guys, come on, check these guys out." And all of a sudden, sometimes you have to perk your ears up and listen. Turned out, after the police investigation 2.5 years later, it was a friendship that had gone awry, had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. They had freaked us out because two guys who were business partners were mad at each other. Had nothing to do with Jews.
So they found the people.
Yeah, found the people, found like what they were arguing about, had nothing to do with Jews. It was a way to get their attention. Had nothing to do with us.
And it did.
But the aftermath of that story is the next day, that Jewish day school hires an off-duty police officer to welcome the kids in. So my 3-year-old son has an experience there for the past 7 years of his life, 6 years of his life. He's been greeted every day by a police officer to go to Jewish day school. He only knows to be safe means to say good morning to the police officer. To go to synagogue, to go to day school means first you say hello to the police officer. That's a very different lifestyle than I ever expected to give my child. Right? So when we're talking about a resurrection of anti-Semitism, one of the things I have to deal with is this new hatred has put so much challenge in front of my 10-year-old's face. He doesn't always know when he's safe. And thankfully, he's got a very protected, sheltered life. He's always safe. But we have done some really tragic things to our children. It's tough. Amy, go ahead.
So I want to be careful when I say this because I don't want to come off sounding bitter or angry or anything. But one of the things that I really struggle as I've, become more friendly with more Christians in some ways than I have in the past because of our involvement at my husband's church, is that the feeling that I get, I feel very torn a lot because the feelings that I get from individual people, including the pastor at this church, is so warm and so accepting and so protective of me as a person and us as a group and so welcoming. And then I read what they write, what they read every week in the liturgy. And especially at this time of year, we're approaching Holy Week. And it's so obvious that the language that is used in Christian worship day after day, week after week, year after year, is so fundamental to the whole development of anti-Jewish feeling. And it's like, it's not even visible to them. So I don't think that these people, if you ask them about it, they would say, what's the matter with it? If you ask them how they feel about anti-Semitic acts that are committed against Jewish communities, they express horror. They express a desire to be part of a protective community for us. And yet they go and they listen to this and it's like they don't hear it. And I don't know,
Amy,
I don't know what to do with that.
No, I think I want to appreciate your comment because one thing we can honestly say that has given me great buoyancy in the last 3.5 years since Pittsburgh, we'll go into detail with this in a couple of weeks, is the sense of our interfaith partners, right? We have never been loved and cherished and warmly supported as Jews have today, right? 90% of Christians think warmly of Jews. It's phenomenal that 90% of Christians trust Jews. It's a phenomenal polling data, and that hasn't changed in the last. So on one hand, overwhelmingly, we are loved and supported by our Christian neighbors, and that is really invaluable right now. And the guy that went to the Kent or to the Stowe store with hatchets on his belt to kill Jews at Kent State on the 50th anniversary of May 4th was supposed to get out of jail last week. And the FBI said, you know, why don't you keep him at least through May 4th? Hold him out for a couple more months, right? So there are people in our community that don't wish us well. And luckily, they're very few. Luckily, they're marginalized. Luckily, we even know who they are, right? It's not like we know this guy, we know where he lives in Canton and so on. So it's this and that. So to hold the fullness that we are both loved and supported, and there's people out there that are dangerous. David, last thought, and we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, Amy, I agree with you about small print. My wife and I, for years, were going to a very large Protestant church in Hudson. And I looked at their website, and in the very smallest print you can get and find, it said, the man is the leader and the woman has to follow what the man tells her. It's very hard to find it, but if you search the smallest small print, that's what it says.
Oh, go ahead, Alex.
I wrap it up. Start off land with the book. Just it stands out how much hatred is a fire, and it consumes you, because when Elie Wiesel was taken to Auschwitz, I mean, American troops were in Italy, Russian troops were coming into Romania, and they were wasting thousands of able-bodied German soldiers counting up Jews for nothing.
Yeah.
I mean, Anne Frank, American soldiers were 200 miles, and they were still waiting and resources, not fighting the war, but doing something completely just hate fueled.
No, Wiesel's question after the book to every political leader was, why didn't the British and the Americans bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz? They could have. But they knew for years. They broke the code, right? They knew for years what was going on. They bombed those tracks.
Yeah, I love
He like a long, so.
So I'm going to Gordon, you can wrap this up and then we'll call it a day. So
All right, one more thing I'd like to say is, in my experience, everybody had to read the book Night and everybody had to write an essay on it.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I do think that there are certain books that open our eyes, and you know, similarly, the book that I'm thinking about bringing for Yom HaShoah here is Mouse. That if we all spent an afternoon reading Mouse, so that would be a very timely thing to do, right? To say, okay, so let's actually read what's in that book and see like why these books are so helpful.
What is Mouse?
Mouse is the graphic novel that is being banned in Tennessee from 8th graders, because 8th graders shouldn't be reading books that are pornographic.
If anybody wants to borrow it, let me know.
That's great. Terry, go ahead.
My question actually is not for the rabbi, it's for Amy. What were you hearing in the Christian liturgy that you felt was anti-Jewish? I wouldn't say Semitic, but
Well, just the whole, you know, this Lenten period, and then certainly during Holy Week, you know, the storyline of the Jews being responsible for the death of Christ is front and center and explicit.
Okay.
Yeah, Terry, let me kind of give you like a bit of detail on that, if we really are looking for anti-Semitism, religious anti-Semitism, right? It's different than the racial anti-Semitism, but religious anti-Semitism based on the Pharisees and how the Pharisees are misunderstood. If the rabbis, the Jewish rabbis, are by extension the logical outgrowth of the Pharisees, then when Catholics are talking about how the Pharisees were traitorous to Jesus, And it raises a lot of problematic language about, are we still pointing fingers at the children of the Pharisees, meaning us today, but are we still traitorous to Jesus? And so there's some logical extensions of that if we're still blaming. Now, one comment I didn't make that I should have, because I was very critical of the Catholic Church today for good reason. In 1964 at Vatican II, the Catholic Church did revoke much of its anti-Semitic language. Much of it was revoked. Abraham Joshua Heschel was part of that committee that asked them for that revoke. And since 64, the Catholic Church has been very honest about its anti-Semitic past and has been seeking forgiveness from the Jewish community on a regular basis.
Why didn't the Catholics, the Christians blame the Romans who killed Jesus?
Whole other point. Anyway,
Okay,
thank
but
you for,
still being, I mean, it's still being said, Amy, and
Oh, yeah.
right. So during Holy Week, right, when Jesus is being resurrected, they want to get into details about Holy Week. If you go to the services around Holy Week, you'll read of criticism and critical language of the Pharisees.
It's at the, when I was Episcopalian, it's really insidious because what they do is they have a play that is acted out by the whole people, everyone at the church with the children and everything there. And it's an acting out of the condemnation and sentencing to death of Jesus Christ. And there's a part that is played by quote unquote the Jews. The Jews have a voice in this play. And what happens is that all of the congregants, the entire church, not the clergy, but the people in the pews, have to say their line is over and over again to say, crucify him, crucify him. So there'll be like a moderator who says, and then the Jews say, crucify, and you do it over and over again. And how can a child not end up being anti-Semitic when everybody has to play this thing and repeat it and do it every year? And I don't know how many times I've written to the head of the church saying, how can they do this? This is 2002. Why are they doing this? This is 2020. Why are they doing this? I can't understand it. It's horrible.
Amy Jill Levine, I'll give like at least some academic credit. Amy Jill Levine is a Bible scholar who's a Jewish Bible scholar writing for Christians. She has a new book. She's trying to teach Christian scholars in seminary, you need to clean up your act. You've been messy on this one. You need to clean up your act.
At what point, if at all, did Jesus stop becoming Jewish as he was born and raised and become Christian?
He didn't. Jewish till the day he died. He kept kosher, he kept Shabbat, and we could actually think of him as a kind of a rabbi. And so part of this, it goes back to our session on other early rabbis. We don't think of Jesus ever being anything but Jewish.
Yeah, and the Last Supper was Passover.
So part of this is, if we reframe our perspective on Jesus as a practicing Jew, then we have to then have a very different perspective on what's going on with the words of Jesus. Okay, thank you for a very, very interesting session, a heavy one, hard session. Anti-Semitism and the Holocaust are always hard and heavy. I appreciate your thoughts and your comments today. Next week, we're going to talk about Israel and Palestine, and we'll continue this conversation next week. I look forward to seeing everyone. I'll send out an email with the exact readings and the page numbers, probably later tonight or tomorrow morning. Take care, everybody. Have a great time.